He threw her out of the house, unaware she was carrying his twin daughters. Years later, he realized it was the most expensive mistake of his life. The moment Lillian Rivers understood that her marriage was over did not come with shouting or broken dishes. It came quietly, cruelly, in the echo of unfamiliar footsteps on the marble floor of the house she had once believed was her sanctuary. Alexander stood near the staircase, tall and composed as always, his dark hair perfectly styled, his blue eyes distant and unreadable. Beside him was another woman. Young, blonde, confident, her hand resting possessively on his arm as if it had always belonged there. "This is Emily," he said flatly, as if introducing a business partner, not the woman who had replaced his wife. "She'll be staying here." Lillian felt the air leave her lungs. For years, she had learned to read Alexander's moods, to recognize the subtle changes in his voice, the barely noticeable tension in his jaw. But now there was nothing to read. He was calm. Final. "What does that mean?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer. "It means you need to pack your things," Alexander replied. "This house is no longer yours." The words struck harder than a slap. Lillian's fingers instinctively pressed against her lower abdomen, a small, unconscious gesture meant to protect the secret growing inside her. Only she knew about the pregnancy. Only she had heard the doctor's quiet confirmation a few days earlier. She had planned to tell him tonight. She had imagined his reaction, the surprise, maybe even joy. Now that future collapsed into dust. Emily looked around the house with thinly veiled satisfaction, her blue eyes scanning the expensive furniture, the artwork Lillian had chosen, the life Lillian had built piece by piece. There was no apology in her gaze. No shame. "I'll give you an hour," Alexander added, already turning away. "My lawyer will handle the rest." Lillian did not beg. She did not scream. Pride, the last thing she still owned, kept her spine straight as she walked upstairs. The bedroom felt now, stripped of warmth the moment his words had been spoken. She packed slowly, mechanically, choosing only the essentials. Clothes. Documents. A small framed photo from better days, which she hesitated over before slipping into her bag. When she returned downstairs, Alexander was no longer looking at her. Emily had taken her place beside him, as if Lillian had already been erased. The front door opened easily. Too easily. As she stepped outside, the door closed behind her with a soft, definitive click. No dramatic slam. Just silence. Lillian stood on the steps for a long moment, the evening air cool against her skin. Then she placed a hand over her stomach again, her eyes filling with tears she refused to let fall. "For you," she whispered to the unborn children she carried. "I will survive." And without looking back, she walked away. The night after she was thrown out of the house felt endless. Lillian sat on the narrow bed of a cheap motel room, staring at the faded wallpaper as if it might give her answers. The silence was heavy, broken only by the distant sound of traffic and the quiet ticking of an old clock on the wall. For the first time in years, no one knew where she was, no one was waiting for her, and no one cared how she felt. The realization hurt more than the cold words Alexander had spoken earlier that day. Her phone lay on the nightstand. No missed calls. No messages. She turned it face down and wrapped her arms around herself, trying to steady the storm inside her chest. Every emotion came at once: humiliation, grief, anger, and beneath it all, fear. Not for herself, but for the fragile life she carried. She was no longer alone. She had not been alone even when he told her to leave. A few days later, she sat in a small medical office, the smell of antiseptic filling the air. The doctor studied the ultrasound screen in silence, then smiled gently. "You're pregnant with twins," she said. "2 healthy babies. Most likely girls." The words echoed in Lillian's mind, unreal and overwhelming. Twins. 2 hearts. 2 lives completely dependent on her. Tears slid down her cheeks, but this time she did not wipe them away. They were not tears of despair. They were tears of clarity. Whatever fear she had felt before began to transform into something stronger. That evening, she walked through a quiet park, leaves crunching under her feet, her mind racing with impossible questions. How would she do this alone? Where would she live? How would she protect her children from the truth of their father's cruelty? She stopped near a bench and pressed both hands to her stomach, as if trying to shield them from the world already waiting to be harsh. She thought of telling Alexander. The idea surfaced only for a moment before she pushed it away. He had made his choice without hesitation. He had closed the door without looking back. She would not chase someone who had so easily erased her. Her children would never be a weapon, never a way to beg for love. That night, lying in the darkness, Lillian made a promise to herself. No matter how hard it became, no matter how lonely the road ahead, she would build a life where her daughters would feel wanted, safe, and proud of the woman who raised them. The pain would not disappear, but it would no longer control her. With that promise burning quietly inside her, Lillian finally fell asleep, holding her secret close to her heart. Starting over did not happen in one dramatic moment. It unfolded slowly, through dozens of small, exhausting decisions. Lillian left the city before dawn, carrying a single suitcase and a future she could not yet fully imagine. She chose a different state, far enough that familiar streets and memories would not haunt her every step. When she signed the lease for a tiny one-bedroom apartment above a bakery, the smell of warm bread in the mornings became her first reminder that life, somehow, continued. She changed her last name, not out of shame, but out of self-preservation. Each form she filled out felt like shedding another layer of her past. No one here knew she had once lived in glass-walled mansions or attended charity galas at Alexander's side. Here, she was just Lillian, quiet, determined, invisible. Pregnancy was not kind to her. Morning sickness followed her through long bus rides and night shifts. She found work as a receptionist during the day and cleaned offices after hours, saving every dollar with careful precision. Some nights, exhaustion pressed so heavily on her chest that she wondered how she would make it through another week. But every time she felt herself falter, she remembered the ultrasound image folded carefully in her wallet. 2 small shapes. 2 reasons not to give up. Loneliness became her constant companion. There was no one to share the small milestones with, the first kicks, the first time she heard 2 heartbeats instead of 1. She learned to celebrate quietly, sitting on the edge of her bed with a hand over her stomach, whispering words of encouragement to children who could not yet hear her. The silence hurt, but it also made her stronger. There was no one coming to save her. She had to save herself. Meanwhile, in a world she no longer belonged to, Alexander continued his life as if nothing had truly changed. The headlines still carried his name, his business empire still grew, and Emily still occupied the house Lillian had once called home. But beneath the polished surface, something was missing. The rooms felt too large, too empty, and even success tasted strangely dull. Lillian did not know any of this. She was too busy surviving. Each day was measured not in happiness, but in progress. Another bill paid, another shift completed, another step closer to stability. By the time her pregnancy began to show, she had built a fragile routine held together by discipline and quiet hope. On certain nights, when the city outside her window finally slept, Lillian allowed herself to imagine the future. Not a perfect one, but a real one. 2 little girls with dark hair and bright eyes, laughter filling the small apartment, love strong enough to make the walls feel wide. The pain of the past still existed, but it no longer defined her. She was no longer just a woman who had been discarded. She was becoming a mother, and that changed everything. Time passed, but it did not soften Alexander's thoughts the way he had expected it to. From the outside, his life looked unchanged, better, even. His companies expanded, his name appeared in financial headlines, and his schedule remained filled with meetings, flights, and negotiations that shaped entire markets. Yet something inside him had shifted, quietly and persistently, like a fault line slowly widening beneath solid ground. Emily moved through the house as if it belonged to her by right. She redecorated rooms, replaced paintings, hosted gatherings filled with laughter that felt too loud, too forced. She was beautiful, ambitious, and eager to be admired, but Alexander found himself increasingly irritated by her presence. Conversations felt shallow. Her compliments rang hollow. At night, when the city lights flickered through the windows, he lay awake with an unfamiliar heaviness pressing against his chest. He began to think of Lillian without meaning to. Not in dramatic flashes, but in small, inconvenient moments. The way she used to sit quietly with a book while he worked late. The calm steadiness in her voice when the world around him felt chaotic. He realized, with growing discomfort, that she had never demanded his attention, she had simply been there, anchoring him without him ever acknowledging it. One evening, after an argument with Emily over something trivial he could no longer remember, Alexander made a decision he told himself was purely practical. He hired a private investigator. He justified it as curiosity, as unfinished business. He did not allow himself to call it regret. The report arrived weeks later, thinner than he expected, but heavy in his hands. He skimmed the first page without interest: relocation, name change, modest employment, until a single line forced him to stop breathing. 2 children. Female. Estimated age, under 1 year. His fingers tightened around the folder. He reread the sentence again and again, as if it might change. Images flooded his mind uninvited: Lillian's quiet composure, her sudden distance in those final days, the way she had pressed her hand to her stomach when he told her to leave. Details he had dismissed at the time now rearranged themselves into a truth he could no longer avoid. When he reached the photographs, the room seemed to tilt. 2 small faces stared back at him, impossibly familiar. Dark hair. Blue eyes. His eyes. The resemblance was undeniable, cruel in its clarity. For the first time in years, Alexander felt something close to panic. Not the controlled tension of business risk, but raw, disorienting shock. He had not just lost a wife. He had erased his own children without ever knowing they existed. Emily tried to speak to him that night, but he barely heard her. The house felt suffocating, filled with echoes of decisions he could not undo. He understood then, with painful certainty, that the mistake he had made was far greater than betrayal. It was abandonment. The photographs stayed on Alexander's desk long after everyone had left the office. The building was silent, the city far below reduced to scattered lights, but his thoughts were loud and relentless. He studied the faces of the 2 girls as if the answer to everything he had destroyed might be hidden in the curve of their cheeks or the familiar shade of their eyes. They were not abstract facts on a report anymore. They were real, living proof of his failure. For the first time, his wealth felt useless. No amount of money could rewind time or return the moment when Lillian might have told him the truth, had he given her the chance. He remembered her calm dignity as she walked out of the house, the absence of tears, the way she never once asked him to reconsider. What he had taken for indifference now revealed itself as quiet strength. Emily confronted him the next morning. She had noticed the change, the distance, the silence, the way his attention drifted far beyond her words. When she demanded answers, he did not bother to soften the truth. "I have children," he said simply. The room froze. Emily laughed at first, convinced it was some cruel joke, until she saw his expression. Her shock quickly turned to anger, then resentment. She accused him of living in the past, of letting a woman who no longer mattered control his life. The argument escalated, sharp and bitter, exposing everything they had never been to each other. By the end of the day, Emily packed her bags. The departure was loud, dramatic, and final, but Alexander felt no sense of loss. When the door closed behind her, the house returned to its familiar emptiness. This time, he did not try to fill it with distractions. That night, he poured himself a drink and stood by the window, staring at his reflection in the glass. He saw a man who had always believed control was the same as strength. A man who had mistaken silence for weakness and loyalty for something guaranteed. The truth was impossible to escape now. He had destroyed his family long before he ever realized he had won. Guilt settled into him, heavy and unyielding. Not the fleeting kind that could be buried under work or luxury, but something deeper, something that demanded acknowledgement. He had missed the first heartbeat, the first breath, the first cry of his daughters. Moments that would never be his, no matter how much he was willing to pay. For the first time in his life, Alexander understood that some losses were permanent. And the knowledge that his children were growing up without him, without even knowing who he was, hurt more than any financial failure ever had. He knew one thing with certainty: he could never undo what he had done. But he could no longer pretend it didn't matter. 2 years passed before Alexander found the courage to face what he had left behind. In that time, the world had continued moving forward, indifferent to his regret. The twins were no longer infants hidden in photographs. They were children with names, routines, and personalities shaped without him. When the private investigator finally provided Lillian's address, Alexander held the paper for a long time before acting, as if touching it might shatter what little control he had left. Lillian opened the door herself. For a brief second, neither of them spoke. She looked different, but not in the way he had expected. There was no fragility in her posture, no bitterness in her eyes. Her brown hair was pulled back simply, her face calm and composed. The exhaustion was there, but so was something stronger, confidence born of survival. "I made a mistake," Alexander said at last. The words felt small, inadequate, yet they were all he had. "Yes," Lillian replied quietly. "And you live with it." Behind her, laughter echoed from the next room. 2 little girls ran past the doorway, their movements quick and clumsy, their voices bright. Alexander's breath caught as he saw them clearly for the first time. Dark hair. Blue eyes. His eyes. They glanced at him with casual curiosity before disappearing again, unaware of who he was or why his hands trembled at his sides. Lillian stepped outside and closed the door behind her, shielding the children from a conversation they did not need to hear. She listened without interruption as Alexander spoke, about regret, about ignorance, about the emptiness his success could not fill. When he finished, there was a long pause. "I'm not here to ask for forgiveness," he said finally. "I just want to know them. To be part of their lives if you'll allow it." She studied him carefully, weighing every word against years of silence. Trust did not come easily anymore. But she also understood that her daughters would one day ask questions she could not answer alone. "You can see them," Lillian said at last. Slowly. "On my terms." Relief washed over his face, but she raised her hand before he could speak again. "This changes nothing between us," she added. "There is no way back." Alexander nodded. He knew better than to argue. The wall between them was solid, built from choices he could never undo. As he left, he glanced once more at the closed door, aware that while it had opened slightly for his children, it would remain firmly shut for him. Inside, Lillian listened to his footsteps fade away and exhaled slowly. She had allowed him into their lives, not out of weakness, but out of strength. Life settled into a cautious rhythm after Alexander's return, one that revolved around the twins and the boundaries Lillian had drawn with quiet firmness. His visits were short and infrequent at first, carefully supervised, almost formal. He brought toys that were too expensive and clothes that were impractical, clearly chosen by someone who did not yet understand their lives. The girls accepted his presence without question, greeting him with innocent curiosity, and moving on just as easily when he left. It was during this fragile period that Michael entered their lives. He was not introduced through drama or coincidence, but through something painfully ordinary. One of the girls had fallen at the playground, scraping her knee badly enough to require stitches. At the clinic, Michael Harper was the doctor on duty. He spoke gently, knelt to the child's eye level, and turned fear into calm with practiced ease. By the time they left, the tears had dried, replaced by shy smiles and a new stuffed animal he had produced from a drawer. Michael began appearing more often after that, first as a familiar face at follow-up visits, then as someone who lingered a little longer to ask how Lillian was managing with 2 toddlers on her own. There was no pressure in his attention, no hidden expectation. He listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, his words were thoughtful and sincere. For Lillian, the change was subtle but profound. She had grown used to carrying everything alone, to measuring her strength by how little she needed from others. Michael did not try to rescue her or impress her. He simply showed up. When one of the girls had nightmares, he sat on the floor and told stories until she fell asleep again. When Lillian was too exhausted to cook, he arrived with groceries and quietly filled the kitchen with warmth and normalcy. Alexander noticed the difference almost immediately. The apartment felt different, lighter, more alive. The girls laughed more freely when Michael was around, climbing into his arms without hesitation. There was no trace of fear or obligation in their affection, only trust. Watching this stirred something uncomfortable inside Alexander, something he recognized too well. He saw what he could never be. Not because he lacked resources, but because he had arrived too late. Michael knew their routines, their favorite snacks, the songs that calmed them before bed. He knew Lillian's silences, too, the ones that did not ask for solutions, only understanding. One evening, as Alexander prepared to leave after a visit, he paused at the door. Michael was in the kitchen, helping the girls wash their hands, laughter echoing softly down the hallway. Lillian stood nearby, relaxed in a way Alexander had not seen in years. In that moment, the truth settled heavily in his chest. Love had grown in the space he had abandoned. And no matter how deeply he regretted the past, he could not compete with a man who had chosen to stay. The crisis came suddenly, without warning, as most true tests do. One evening, one of the twins developed a high fever that refused to break. By midnight, her small body was trembling, her breathing shallow and uneven. Lillian's hands shook as she held her, fear cutting through her with a sharpness she had never known. This was different from scraped knees or sleepless nights. This was something she could not fix on her own. Michael was there within minutes of her call. He did not waste time on reassurances or explanations. He wrapped the child in a blanket, checked her vital signs, and drove them to the hospital himself. In the emergency room, his professional calm became a lifeline. Doctors moved quickly, tests were ordered, and Lillian was left sitting in a hard plastic chair, staring at the white walls as if they might collapse around her. When Alexander arrived, summoned by a brief, hesitant message Lillian had sent in a moment of desperation, the atmosphere shifted. He came with everything money could buy: connections, private specialists, access to the best facilities in the state. Within hours, the child was transferred to a top-tier clinic, surrounded by advanced equipment and experts who spoke in precise, measured tones. Yet it was Michael who never left the bedside. He slept in a chair, holding the little girl's hand through the night, waking at every change in her breathing. When Lillian's strength finally faltered, it was Michael who wrapped an arm around her shoulders, offering silent support that did not demand gratitude. Alexander watched from a distance, torn between relief and a growing sense of displacement. He paid for everything, arranged everything, controlled everything he could. But there were moments when control meant nothing. When the child whimpered in her sleep, she reached instinctively for Michael, not him. And when Lillian broke down in tears in the hallway, it was Michael she leaned against. Days passed slowly, measured by monitors and whispered conversations with doctors. When the fever finally broke and the danger eased, Lillian felt something inside her shift irrevocably. She was grateful to Alexander for what he had done. She would always acknowledge that. But gratitude was not love, and responsibility was not presence. Standing by the hospital window in the early morning light, watching Michael gently smooth her daughter's hair as she slept, Lillian understood the truth with painful clarity. The man who had stood beside her in fear, not just in comfort, was the one her heart had chosen. And in that realization, there was no doubt left. The conversation happened on an ordinary afternoon, once life had returned to something resembling normal. The girls were playing on the living room floor, building uneven towers out of wooden blocks, their laughter filling the apartment with light. Lillian watched them for a moment before turning to Alexander, who stood near the window, hands in his pockets, as if bracing himself for what he already sensed was coming. "We need to be clear," she said quietly. He nodded, his expression serious, attentive. There was no arrogance left in him now, only a restrained humility shaped by loss. "I will never come back to you," Lillian continued. "Not now. Not ever." The words were firm, but not cruel. She had carried them inside her for a long time, waiting for the moment they needed to be spoken aloud. Alexander closed his eyes briefly, as if absorbing a blow he had prepared for but still could not fully escape. "I know," he replied. "I've known for a while." Silence settled between them, not hostile, but heavy with unspoken understanding. The past stood there with them, visible in every corner of the room, yet no longer powerful enough to dictate the future. "I won't stand in the way of your happiness," he said at last. "I see what you have now. And I see what I lost." Lillian studied him, searching for any trace of manipulation, any attempt to rewrite history. There was none. Only acceptance. "You can be their father," she said, gesturing toward the twins. "They deserve that. But you cannot be my partner. That part of my life is closed." He nodded again, this time more slowly. "Thank you," he said, "for trusting me with them. I don't expect anything more." When he knelt to say goodbye to the girls, they hugged him easily, their affection uncomplicated and free of resentment. Watching them, Alexander felt both gratitude and regret intertwine in a way he knew would never fully untangle. As he left, Lillian felt an unexpected sense of peace. She had not won or lost anything. She had simply chosen honesty over illusion. The door closed behind him, not in anger, but in resolution. For the first time, the future felt clean and unburdened by doubt. The years that followed unfolded gently, without the sharp turns and sudden losses that had once defined Lillian's life. Stability replaced survival, and peace replaced constant vigilance. The apartment eventually gave way to a small house filled with light, laughter, and the comfortable chaos of family life. The twins grew quickly, their personalities blooming in different directions while remaining inseparably close, bound by a shared beginning and a deep sense of security. Michael became their anchor. He never tried to replace their father, never blurred the lines Lillian had so carefully drawn. Instead, he became something equally important, someone who chose them every day. He attended school events, patched scraped knees, and sat through endless bedtime stories with the same patience he showed in his work. The girls trusted him instinctively, and that trust was built on years of consistency, not grand gestures. Alexander remained present, but at a respectful distance. He provided generously, ensuring his daughters would never lack opportunity, but he no longer used wealth as a substitute for involvement. He learned how to listen, how to arrive on time, how to accept that some moments would never belong to him. Watching Lillian from afar, he understood that loving her now meant honoring the life she had built without him. Lillian married Michael on a quiet autumn day, surrounded by people who had earned their place in her world. There was no bitterness in her heart, no lingering regret. Only gratitude for the strength she had discovered within herself and for the love that had grown patiently where trust once had been broken. Sometimes, in rare reflective moments, she thought back to the woman who had stood on the steps of a mansion with nothing but a suitcase and a secret. That woman had been afraid, but she had also been brave enough to walk forward. Everything that followed existed because she had refused to turn back. Life had not given her the ending she once imagined. It had given her something better: truth, dignity, and a love that did not require sacrifice to survive. This story is not about revenge or reclaiming the past. It is about choice and responsibility. Sometimes life breaks us not to destroy us, but to show us our true worth. The moral is clear and uncompromising: Love cannot be postponed, and loyalty cannot be tested by losing someone. And once a woman chooses herself and her children, she will never be the same again. Can betrayal ever truly be forgiven if realization comes too late? Or are some doors meant to stay closed forever?